Ari at breakfast.
Morning to you, 5 minutes after 9 on Friday, the 6th of September. Now, there's no shortage of senior politicians who come into this studio and who come here to take your calls and to answer your questions. The leaders of political parties, we've had prime ministers, we all regularly have the mayor. But for one particular politician, the amount of coverage that he garners, given the current state of political representation in the House of Commons, is remarkable. It's the leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage, rarely out of the headlines. Indeed, he was in the headlines again this week, although not really of his making. This time it was Andy Coulson who was suggesting that Nigel Farage is in fact Mr. Mirage. He was also calling for a YouTube video of the less pleasant and stranger utterances from Mr. Farage. We might get on that in just a second, but he's here to take your calls, answer your questions. Leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage. Welcome to the studio. Nigel, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Before we necessarily reflect on what Andy Coulson has been saying about you, one story that's not out of the headlines is Syria. We haven't heard a lot from you yet about that. Where do you think we are? What do you take from G20? What is the way forward?
Well, last week I unveiled a poster truck outside the Palace of Westminster with a very simple headline: UKIP says no to war in Syria. Our view is that this country is getting involved in an endless series of foreign wars that are not directly in our national interest at a huge cost, not just financially, but the thousands of people that have been severely injured, dead, and the British public have had enough. And I'm not a pacifist. I believed in retaking the Falklands. I believed in stopping Saddam after Kuwait. But I questioned, since Afghanistan, every single thing we've done, including Libya. So our view was out there, and it was very clear. And I think that quite a few of those rebels last week were people in constituencies where they're really fearful of the UKIP vote. You know, they know that we've carried opinion on Europe and immigration. And I think for many of them, this was the final straw. And I think what UKIP's done, what the local election results on May the 2nd have done, is it's changed the political dimension in this country, and the backbenchers in the Labour and Conservative parties will no longer go along with a three-line whip. They will break it. And what it means is we're in for a period, I think, of real change.
You say war, but President Obama, David Cameron, everybody would go out of their way to say, Nigel Farage, it's not war, it's limited military action, it's targeted strikes.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? This time last week, we were told that the attacks were to punish Assad for using chemical weapons, even though we didn't have incontrovertible proof that it was him that had used it. Now, a week on, we're told it's about regime change. So already we're seeing a change in the reasons that America wants to go to war. And I'd love Mr. Obama to tell us, if he removes Assad, who takes over then? Is he taking over? Is Al-Qaeda taking over? Is there any strategy? Is there any plan? I don't think so.
A week ago today, the day after the vote, Lord Ashdown, formerly Paddy Ashdown, said that people who would be celebrating, that he himself felt depressed, he'd never felt so miserable to be British, and the only people celebrating would be Vladimir Putin and Nigel Farage.
I know he did, and not necessarily the company I'd choose for lunch. Paddy is part of that consensus that's existed for the last 15 years in British politics, where the three-party leaders agree on virtually everything. Paddy, I'm sorry, it's changed. The British public do not want to go and get involved in a series of endless wars, and I thought what happened last Thursday was a great victory for democracy. And not just in this country, but a message it sent out to the world that people can change things.
You're not just being different to be difficult, to be deliberate. You genuinely don't agree with what the other three...
We openly, clearly as a party, oppose the Iraq war. We oppose the bombing of Libya, and we believe that is now more unstable than it was when Gaddafi, however bad he might have been, was there. And we were the first party over a year ago on Question Time to say we can see the West building up for military strikes on Syria, and we want nothing to do with it.
So what would the UKIP policy be now?
With Syria?
Yeah, and with Obama banging on the door asking for help.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? If you go back a few years, when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, Lyndon Johnson came swaggering into Downing Street and said, Mr. Wilson, because of the special relationship, you must send troops to fight with us in Vietnam. And Harold Wilson said no. And thank goodness Harold Wilson said no. The point about a special relationship is you don't, when they say jump, ask how high.
Your calls to Nigel Farage in just a moment. One last question. You say that all our senior three politicians all get on, Nigel, but I don't know if you're aware that a very close aide to David Cameron in the aftermath of that vote branded Ed Miliband, an effing C word and a copper-bottomed S. Do you think he was onto something there?
Well, in the heat of parliamentary debate, these things do happen.
What's your take on Mr. Miliband, then?
He clearly doesn't really have a thought of his own at all. And on the Monday of last week, he was all for supporting limited military action. Then he realised that the country didn't want it and that many of his own backbenchers didn't want it, and they'd been dragooned into supporting the Iraq war. And so he changed his mind and went for this sort of equivocal halfway house. And that's the Miliband problem. You know, who is Ed Miliband and what is the Labour Party? Is it a party that stands up still for working class interests? I don't think so. It appears to be a party run by a very narrow metropolitan elite.
Let's take some calls. You've got your headphones on. We're good to go. Yep. Ed's in Hounslow. You're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead, Ed.
Good morning, Nick, and good morning, Nigel.
Good morning.
Pleasure to speak to you. I want to ask you a question about the activities of the Home Office, which I think you've already condemned, in relation to sending out poster vans, which have had what many people regard as insulting, inflammatory slogans written across them, and also their practice of sending out border agency officers to stop people at places like tube stations and so on, and demand of them that which they are not under any obligation to give, that they, provide...
Show some papers. Yeah. Down the line, Ed, I'm just going to remind listeners, this is, of course, the pilot in, I think, 6 London boroughs with the truck if you're here illegally, and then in very, very large type, go home, and a text number, and attracted quite a degree of attention. Nigel, to stay on the line, Ed, Nigel Farage.
Ed, it's all a diversion. It's all showing how tough they're going to be. It's interesting. Since the May the 2nd local election results, they've all talked tough on immigration, but listen carefully to what they say. They're being tough on non-EU immigration because they know that on the 1st of January next year, the doors are opening to the whole of Bulgaria and Romania, and they want to show the world before that happens how tough they are.
How many are coming? How many Bulgarians and Romanians, Nigel Farage, do you think are on their way?
Well, when we opened up the doors to Poland and Lithuania and 6 other Eastern European countries, David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, told us there'd be an extra 13,000 a year, and 800,000 came in the first 2 years. If you look at Romania and Bulgaria, they are poorer than Poland and Latvia and Lithuania. I've been to both of those countries. Frankly, I've been shocked at the conditions that the Roma community live in.
In what way shocked, Nigel?
Oh, I mean, I went to the big Roma camp outside Sofia. I mean, there are 70,000 Roma families, Roma people living there, no proper sanitation, no work. I mean, the whole thing was truly shocking. I mean, living like animals.
Right.
You know, really shocking and discriminated against. They find it virtually impossible to get work even if they want to go out and get it.
And you sense they'll head to Britain?
Well, what would you do? I mean, if an opportunity came up where you could come to a country that was a civilised country with a decent health service that would provide you with housing, give you a chance of... I mean, what would you do? I mean, come on. You know, and I'm not. None of this, I want to make this absolutely clear, that we in UKIP are not against anybody from any other part of the world or any religion or any race, but it's about time we started putting the interests of British people first. We've got 1 million... youngsters in this country unemployed. We've got skilled men and women who've seen their wages driven down, and we now have, and no one dares talk about this, but in London we now have a Romanian crime wave epidemic which can only get worse. So the poster trucks and the poster vans are designed to divert your attention, and frankly, driving vans around saying we're coming to get you struck me as being a very un-British way of approaching it.
You say that UKIP is not against people coming here. I refer you to some of the former members of the party, councillors who've sent offensive material about Muslims on Facebook, another candidate who I think supported an extreme racist group, another candidate who had problems with homosexuality.
Well,
you've got quite a broad coalition, haven't you?
Well, that's the same for every party, isn't it? I mean, unlike Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative, I put a rule in place that anybody who's a former member of the BNP may not even join our party as a member. So we don't want anybody like that involved with us. The fact that 1 or 2 people join UKIP and say silly things is hardly a surprise. In some cases, I've no doubt it's orchestrated. But compare us to the Labour Party, who've got people who were elected as BNP councillors who've now defected to them.
Quick response, Ed, from what you've heard.
Well, I'm pleased to hear Nigel say the things that he has just said. One thing I'd like to highlight, because where I'm actually speaking from here in Hounslow, there's been a particular issue. A local solicitor here, a lady by the name of Transit
Hang on. Well, what do you get now that you've named?
Well, it's in relation to what I've spoken to you about. On the 22nd of last month, she made a complaint to Hounslow Police, having perceived herself to be the victim of a hate crime, in view of having been subjected to having to the indignity of having to see these graffiti-like slogans plastered across these vans, which she perceives as being aimed at people like herself. And I'd like to highlight the fact that I think what the government is doing is trying to put in the minds of the public the fact that having a concern about immigration is one and the same thing as being in support of racism, which of course it is not.
All right, Ed, I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Let's get other matters, though. Stan's in Mayfair. You're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead, Stan.
Hello, boys. How are you doing, all right?
Yeah, good. Quite, go ahead.
An interesting set of figures come out recently was that it's not just European claimants, which is 139,000 a year. We've got claimants of 102,000 from Africa and 132,000 claimants from Asia and Middle East, which basically means that 1 in 14 people are claiming benefits in this country. Now, when people were speaking to Nick earlier from Spain, English people are going to Spain and they're not allowed to claim a penny, whether it be on the National Health or Job Seekers Allowance. Now, we're being told, as mugs in England, all the time, that everywhere in Europe where it's a level playing field and people do the same thing. Why can't we take a leaf out of the Spanish book, or even turn around and say to someone, if they come from Romania and you want to claim something in your country, if you get zilch in your country, you get zilch here. If you get £6 a week in your country, you'll get £6 here.
Let's put that to Nigel Farage.
Because I believe if you join a club, you should abide by the rules. I mean, that is the British way of doing things. That is the Anglo-Saxon custom with law. So I don't advocate being members of the European Union and ignoring all the rules. I advocate not being a member of the European Union and treating people from Bulgaria and Romania no differently to people from any other part of the world. Let's have an immigration policy that is based on people coming here who've got skills to bring us, who haven't got criminal records or life-threatening diseases. Let's have an immigration policy like the Australians and we'd all be a lot happier.
Thanks for that, Stan. Just coming back to what you were saying about G20, it's reported that Vladimir Putin suggests Britain is a small island no one pays attention to.
I'm surprised that he said that. I mean, they are now denying that he said it, but I'm surprised that he said that. I would say this. You know, Paddy Ashdown, who you mentioned earlier, said last week that because we're not going to bomb Syria, that we've lost our international standing. Well, if we're judged only on whether we bomb people, I'm delighted we should lose our international standing. There's hard power and there's soft power. And I want us to be a country that pushes soft power, and we can do it. Why? We speak English. It's the lingua franca of the world. We have a Commonwealth that's got 2 billion people in it. And you know, the interesting thing is, the more people trade and do business with each other, the less likely they are to fight each other. And I want an independent United Kingdom to take back the ability to make trade deals, which we've surrendered, of course, to the European Union. And we can genuinely help the poor by taking tariffs off their agricultural products, by spreading the concept of free trade, beginning perhaps with the Commonwealth countries. I believe we can do a lot more good in the world than just by believing we have to go around bombing people.
And it doesn't bother you that we are no longer part of private conversations with Obama and France is, and at the Military Strategic Planning Centre in Florida, French generals can sit down with the US generals and British generals cannot.
Well, you've got to hand it to John Kerry, haven't you? What a fantastic quote. France, our oldest ally. I mean, I think that for me is the quote of the week. Look, no one talks about NATO here. NATO still exists, and we are very much at the top table of NATO. We have just decided, our Parliament has decided, not our leaders, but our Parliament has decided we're not going to take military action in Syria at the moment. My worry, of course, is that everybody from Paddy Ashdown to even Boris Johnson, which surprised me greatly.
But what did surprise you about Boris Johnson, Mr. Farage?
What they're saying is that perhaps we should have another vote on Syria and whether to take military action. Now, perhaps they've all been to the charm school in Brussels, where, of course, if you say no in a referendum, you're asked to vote again.
But if the evidence changes? If irrefutable evidence
comes through that Assad has used chemical weapons and is doing dreadful things, I will still ask a question. How does firing in thousands of cruise missiles make the situation any stabler or help the suffering people of Syria?
So you let him continue to unleash chemical weapons?
I do not see what we can do that will make the situation in Syria any better.
So he carries on gassing his people?
He may well, and the opposition, infiltrated by Al-Qaeda, will no doubt carry on committing their massacres as well.
And Britain would just stand and watch?
If we genuinely thought there was something we could do that would make it better, we might look at it again. But right at the moment, I have not seen a plan, I have not seen a long-term strategy that suggests to me we can make anything better.
But we did talk about incontrovertible proof, videotape of him unleashing these chemicals. We still just sit and...
Even if we have incontrovertible proof that it's him that has used chemical weapons, that still doesn't answer my question. How can us intervening militarily make it any better? Nobody has explained that to me.
Chris is in Croydon. Chris, you're through to Nigel Farage.
Morning, gents. Just a quick one, if that's okay.
Sure.
Love to hear what you're saying in standing up to the media onslaught about the public's wrong and the media are right about Syria and that you're not being cowed. But does UKIP have a policy on the wholesale privatisation of the public services in this country, whether it's NHS, education, policing, etc., etc.? Everything is being privatised, starting with the internal new market for New Labour and then carried on by the Tories and Liberals.
If we go back a bit to the 80s, I thought privatisation was the right thing to do. And perhaps telecoms is a fantastic example that you privatise something, you allow competition to come in from this country and from across the world, and what you finish up with is massive technological improvement, better range of choice of products and better pricing. But you come to some things where you ask yourself, will privatisation actually make this any better? And we finished up with virtually our entire energy production industry now being in French and German hands when we're not allowed to buy into their industries. And we're just about to go through the privatisation of the post office, something which happened because all the profitable bits of the post office were taken away by a series of European directives. And I'm concerned that if we privatise the post office, that perhaps in a few years' time, the universal postal service will go. So I think there are limits to privatisation. That's not to say, though, that taking the National Health, for example, that they cannot, in some cases, outsource and use. You know, if there's a private hospital down the road that's empty and you've got a waiting list for hip replacements and it's cheap down at the private hospital, then by all means do that. So I'm not against publicly owned services using some private initiatives.
So part privatisation of NHS.
It's not privatisation, actually, but it is using and outsourcing some things to private sector companies. The French public health industry do this, and they get better bang for their buck than we do.
And where does UKIP stand on the NHS? Is it correctly funded? Does it need more funding? Does it need less funding? Do you agree with the cuts?
The one thing it doesn't need is more funding. I mean, after all, it doubled in the years that Labour was in power.
£93 billion a year.
Yeah, it was it was about 40 when Blair took over. So one of the promises that Blair kept was to increase spending. We've seen a massive increase in the growth of middle management in the NHS. Only 51% of NHS employees are clinically trained, which is a pretty astonishing figure when you think about it. And now, if you talk to doctors, one of the big short-term problems is that people now come in from Europe, Eastern Europe particularly, in vast numbers for health tourism on our NHS. Short term, we must stop that. We must say it is a national health service. It's not open to everybody else. Longer term, Nick, I think we're going to have to redefine the NHS. You know, when it came in 1948, the country was less than 50 million people. Life expectancy was 70. Things have changed. There are going to have to be some redefinitions, but the first thing we must do is get better value for money.
Chris, thank you. James, your question in a second. I must get some emails in. Tim in High Wycombe. Me and my partner want to get married. He's a man. Why are you against gay marriage?
Well, because we're part, under the auspices of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, my concern is that if you're allowed in a registry office to use the word marriage, it's a very short step before a legal case is taken to Strasbourg to say that the church, and don't forget, it's a state church in this country, the church won't give me a gay marriage, but the registry office will. That's discriminatory, and I believe there is a risk that the Church of England will be forced into conducting gay marriages by the ECHR in Strasbourg, and I think that tolerance is a two-way street. You know, we've now become a country that is tolerant of gay people. We should stay a country that is tolerant of Christian people too.
And you're tolerant of gay people?
Of course, and you know.
So what's your problem with the word? It's the word marriage, is it? Then?
Yes, I think civil partnerships have worked. The evidence is, since they came in, that in fact breakup rates are lower than they are in the heterosexual community. There've been some huge successes here and some massive advances.
But it's just this word marriage.
Yeah, it's just the word marriage. And I'm also interested that I didn't know anybody that was campaigning for gay marriage. I mean, even Stonewall, the biggest gay charity, were not campaigning for gay marriage. It is astonishing to me that Cameron has driven this through. with such undue haste.
James is in Woodford. You're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead, James.
Good morning, gentlemen. Nigel, what would your first policy be with regard to the horrific cost of housing, especially in London, the South East, and that's after, of course, New Labour allowed in about 6 million migrants, and also, and this lot are letting in as many.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, we were told last week to celebrate. The immigration figures were down. I thought, wow, that's good, isn't it? Only 497,000 people last year that we know of came to Britain. I mean, it's not much to celebrate, is it? 2 quick points on housing, if I can. Number one, you're quite right. A rapidly expanding population means we have demand exceeding supply, which is keeping house prices up. Number 2, London has become a magnet for masses of foreign capital. I don't mind that. But I think we have to revisit the non-dom status rules. You know, how can it be right for very wealthy foreigners to come to Britain and have a better tax break than an ordinary business person living and working in London? I think we should charge a premium for people who want to come and live in our great city. And the third point I want to make quickly is this.
What would that mean to our city, within the city? French bankers, Russian bankers, Japanese bankers.
If it meant that there wasn't quite the same intensive flow of capital coming into the London property market, frankly, Nick, that wouldn't be a bad thing.
But don't we want the city, in the financial, to be the magnet, don't we?
Of course we do.
Well, if you've just persuaded Russian and French bankers not to come here, surely.
But if we have a fair taxation system in this country, then I think everybody that's here should pay that tax. And I think that's a reasonable way forward. Because what we've now got, I mean, you know, I've got a son in his mid-20s with a good job, sharing a house with 4 people in South London. He will not be buying a house until he's 40 or 50. It's become impossible for ordinary folk in London to...
I mean, typically it's about £250,000 for a starter flat, isn't it?
That's right. You know, so that's what I was saying.
And at that end, so at the top end, you've talked about non-doms, Mr. Farage. At your lad's end, I mean, how do people like him get started then under UKIP?
Well, we have to have a situation, of course, where we have an improving economy and where galloping house price inflation in London stops, and that stops by having...
But if the economy improves, surely more people will be onto London, so the prices...
Yeah, I think we've got too much hot money, if I can put it like that, coming into London. You know, we talk a lot about money laundering. What we don't talk about is the last great haven of money laundering, which of course is coming in and buying property. And one last quick point. When you travel, in London not so much, but around the country, you see big city shopping centres that are boarded up, or they're pound shops or charity shops. And upstairs, the flats are all empty. There are 750,000 vacant properties in our city centres. We've got to rethink city centres. Their future is not going to be retail because of the growth of out-of-town stores and because, of course, of online shopping. And I think we need to redevelop many of our city centres to make them places people can live.
David Cameron's former PR chief, Andy Coulson, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Farage, says you should actually be known as Mr. Mirage. There should be a YouTube package of your, quotes, less pleasant and stranger utterances. What would you say back to Mr. Coulson?
He sounds like a lovely bloke, doesn't he? He really does sound like the sort of chap you want to take round to meet mum and have tea. Perhaps this is his last hurrah before the court hearing. I don't know. Talk about stranger utterances. Look, everything I've done on YouTube and in that European Parliament has been open to full public scrutiny for years. So I'm not in the least bit concerned about that stuff being put online.
Your party is a club for disgruntled, invariably older Tories fed up with the leadership's attitude, although most not entirely towards Europe.
Actually, sorry to disappoint you, but
those are Mr. Coulson's words, by the way.
Yeah, completely wrong. 40% of our voters come from the Tory party. 60% of our voters don't come from a Tory party. And increasingly, particularly in the Midlands and North, it's the old Labour vote that UKIP are picking up.
David's in Berkshire. You're through to Nigel Farage. David.
Hi, Nigel.
Good morning.
Closer to home, I'd like to know what you're doing about the foster care incident that happened up in Rotherham during the by-election. I did email you at the time and told you that you were walking into a minefield, that social services were a law unto themselves and you'd walk away from the situation.
Sorry, David, don't go. This is the Eastern European children with the foster parents who were members of UKIP. Just to remind my listeners, David. So your direct question of Mr. Farage is what, David?
Well, what has he done since? I hear all talk about immigration, but why doesn't he deal with something that's going to be a huge issue? Because there's corruption and various other things going on in social services.
All right.
Yeah, it is deeply ironic that of all the local councils, Rotherham took those children away from a foster couple that everybody said were doing a superb job. This, the council, that deliberately turned a blind eye to grooming of young girls that was going on a massive scale. So there's been, a huge amount of child abuse.
Can we say they deliberately did that?
We can't really say no, we can say turn a blind eye.
We turned a blind eye. I think
Absolutely.
we need to perhaps withdraw the deliberately, but certainly they could have done more. Carry on, Mr. Farage.
So we finish up with this foster couple having their kids taken away, having their means of earning a living taken from them. I made a promise at the time that we would give that couple full legal support, and that is exactly what we intend to do.
Intend? Why so long?
Because the appeals and what it's like.
This is November of last year.
Yeah, you know as well as I do that things.
But you're Action Jackson when it comes to politics, Mr. Farage. Why isn't something happening now?
That's why I'm not a lawyer. It would drive me bonkers because it takes years for things to get to court.
But you're offering full support.
We are going to stand by that couple. Make no mistake about it.
Final question is Brian in Crawley. Brian, you're through. Go ahead, sir.
Good morning. Good morning, Nigel. I'd like to know what your take is on the local energy in terms of fracking.
Fracking. We finish with fracking.
Right.
Nigel Farage.
I am 100% opposed to the biggest con I've seen in my life, and that is the building all over England's green and pleasant land and on our seascapes of ugly, useless, bird-chomping wind turbines. They don't work. They cost a fortune. They put 12% on the electricity bill of everybody listening to this show. Fracking has been happening in this country for decades. There is a huge lobby against it. No extractive industry comes without any risk at all. But frankly, if you look at America, and if we do this properly, we are looking a gift horse in the mouth. It will create tens of
poisoned water, I hear.
There's no
cause earthquakes.
Well, yeah, you get all that stuff. But actually, from America, where they've done this on a massive scale, there is zero evidence to support that. This is the chance of a lifetime for this country to reduce energy bills, not just for consumers, but for British manufacturing industry. We should grab it with both hands.
That has been the leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage, with me, Nick Ferrari, on LBC 97.3. Nigel Farage will return. Thank you for your time. News is next.